In the spring of 48 BC, Julius Caesar, the supreme commander of a hardened veteran army, stood on the rugged Adriatic coast near Dyrrhachium and initiated one of the most geographically and logistically paradoxical operations in the history of the Roman Republic. Commanding a starving force of roughly 35,000 men, Caesar ordered the construction of a massive circumvallation wall to lay siege to his greatest rival, Pompey the Great. The Senate's general held the high ground with an opposing army of 50,000 legionaries, heavily fortified and fully supplied by an unbroken maritime tether to the Mediterranean. Caesar believed his superior engineering would force Pompey into submission, but he did not realize he was building a 15-mile cage for his own legions. Welcome back to World Chronicles. Today, we break down the near-fatal disaster at Dyrrhachium, examining the brutal war of attrition, the unprecedented scale of Roman field engineering, and the precise tactical vulnerability that finally shattered the blockade. As Caesar's heavy infantry labored in the coastal dirt to erect forts and trenches, their local food reserves evaporated. To keep his men digging, the supreme commander relied on a desperate logistical improvisation, forcing his veterans to survive by chewing on a bitter, tough wild root called chara, which they mashed and baked into dense, foul-tasting bread. This grim reality defined the climax of the great Roman Civil War. The tactical situation on the shores of modern Albania defied basic military doctrine. A smaller, completely isolated force with no secure lines of communication was attempting to starve out a larger, well-fed garrison that controlled the sea. Caesar's aggressive strategy was driven by supreme arrogance and an unyielding reliance on the unmatched physical endurance of his cohorts. He intended to strip Pompey of his mobility and humiliate the senatorial forces before the eyes of the Republic. However, by overextending his limited manpower across miles of uneven terrain to contain an enemy with absolute naval supremacy, Caesar was inadvertently preparing a death trap. The road to this logistical trap began months earlier, driven by the cold calculus of the Civil War. By late 49 BC, Pompey the Great had abandoned Italy, retreating across the Adriatic Sea to assemble a massive coalition from the wealthy eastern provinces. If left undisturbed, the Senate's general would soon command an unstoppable armada and limitless funding. Caesar understood that time was his greatest enemy. He needed to force a decisive engagement before Pompey's war machine could fully mobilize. To achieve this, the dictator made a strategic gamble that defied conventional Roman naval doctrine. Rather than waiting for the safety of the spring sailing season, Caesar ordered his transport fleet to cross the treacherous winter waters of the Adriatic. He sought to exploit the element of surprise, calculating that the senatorial blockade, commanded by the vigilant Admiral Marcus Calpurnius Bibulus, would be anchored in its winter harbors. The gamble succeeded, but at a severe operational cost. Caesar managed to slip through the blockade and land on the shores of Epirus, but a lack of transport vessels meant he could only bring roughly half his veteran infantry and a token force of cavalry. The moment the Roman transports attempted to return to Italy to ferry the remaining troops commanded by Mark Antony, Bibulus unleashed his retaliation. The senatorial fleet intercepted the returning ships, burning dozens of them to the waterline and executing their crews. This brutal maritime strike effectively severed the Adriatic lifeline. Caesar was now stranded on hostile shores with a fractured army, deeply outnumbered, and entirely cut off from the vast agricultural resources of Italy. While Caesar scrambled to secure a foothold, Pompey recognized the strategic vulnerability of his rival. The Senate's general methodically maneuvered his superior forces to protect his primary logistical hub, the coastal fortress of Dyrrhachium. This city was not just a defensive stronghold. It was the vital artery that connected Pompey's army to the grain shipments of the Mediterranean. As long as Pompey held the port, His 50,000 legionaries and massive cavalry reserve would remain fully fed and equipped, supplied by an unbroken chain of transport ships. Caesar aggressively marched his vanguard north to cut Pompey off from the city, but the reality of naval supremacy quickly paralyzed the campaign. The supreme commander could not risk a direct assault on the fortified walls, nor could he retreat without an operational fleet. For months, the two greatest generals of the Republic engaged in a tense, freezing standoff, both waiting for the ice to thaw and the strategic balance to shift. The stalemate finally broke in the early spring of 48 BC. Mark Antony, leveraging a sudden shift in the southern winds, daringly navigated the remaining transport fleet past the senatorial patrols and landed further up the coast. By executing a rapid forced march, Antony successfully bypassed Pompey's blocking forces and united his legions with Caesar. On a tactical map, this junction appeared to be a masterstroke, finally granting the dictator the heavy infantry required to challenge his rival in the field. Yet, in the unforgiving realm of military logistics, the arrival of reinforcements triggered an immediate crisis. When Mark Antony finally broke the blockade and united the army, Caesar gained the numbers to fight, but he also doubled the mouths he could no longer feed. To break the strategic stalemate and leverage his newly united infantry, Caesar initiated a tactical maneuver that defied basic military convention. Pompey, securely anchored to the port of Dyrrhachium and continuously supplied by the sea, absolutely refused to commit his legions to a pitched battle. He understood that Caesar's logistical tether was non-existent. Time and starvation were the Senate's most reliable weapons. Realizing he could not draw Pompey onto an open field, Caesar decided to cage him. The dictator ordered his veterans to lay down their pila and take up their dolabre, the standard-issue Roman pickaxes. What followed was a brutal war of terrestrial engineering, transforming the rugged Adriatic coastline into a sprawling, multi-layered fortress of timber and soil. Caesar's ambitious blueprint demanded the construction of a massive circumvallation network, a continuous ring of trenches, palisades, and wooden redoubts stretching for 15 miles across the undulating hills surrounding Dyrrhachium. The sheer scale of the earthworks was staggering. Day and night, the coastal air vibrated with the rhythmic, exhausting thud of iron pickaxes biting into hard earth and the sharp crack of timber being felled to construct defensive towers. Yet, the tactical geometry of this operation was deeply flawed. In standard siege warfare, a larger army encamps and surrounds a smaller, isolated garrison. Here, Caesar was forcing a smaller, starving army to continuously stretch its lines to contain a numerically superior force. Every mile of trench dug meant his heavy infantry was spread thinner, desperately trying to maintain a continuous perimeter. Pompey, observing the advancing ring of Roman earthworks, immediately recognized the physical threat to his cavalry. His massive mounted reserve, the core of his tactical superiority, required vast tracts of grazing land to survive. If Caesar successfully pinned the senatorial army directly against the city walls, the horses would quickly exhaust the available forage. To counter this, Pompey launched a parallel engineering campaign. He ordered his own 50,000 legionaries to construct an inner wall, expanding his defensive perimeter outward to encompass as much pasture and as many freshwater streams as possible. The Senate's general deliberately pushed his fortifications southward, forcing Caesar to extend the outer circumvallation line even further to prevent a breakout. The conflict rapidly devolved into a relentless race for altitude. Both commanders understood that holding the elevated terrain dictated the flow of the siege. Localized, highly violent skirmishes erupted daily as opposing cohorts clashed over control of specific hills and ridges. When Caesar's engineers attempted to anchor a new fort on a dominant crest, Pompey's artillery and archers would lay down a suppressing barrage, while his heavy infantry surged up the slopes to dislodge the builders. The war became a grinding, inch-by-inch struggle of attrition, fought not in grand tactical formations, but in brutal close-quarters combat inside muddy, half-finished trenches. Caesar's 9th Legion, tasked with securing the southernmost sector where the hills sloped down toward the sea, faced constant, heavy pressure from Pompey's localized counterattacks. Despite the daily bloodshed and the physical exhaustion of moving millions of cubic feet of earth, the 5-mile perimeter was eventually sealed. Caesar had achieved an unprecedented feat of military engineering, effectively locking the Senate's general inside a sprawling coastal pocket. Yet, the strategic reality of the blockade remained a massive paradox. Pompey was trapped, but his ships continued to arrive daily, offloading grain, weapons, and fresh reinforcements directly onto the beaches of Dyrrhachium. The Roman veterans dug miles of trenches to starve the Senate's general, yet the geography of the coast meant the famine would soon strike the besiegers instead. The vulnerability that finally shattered this grueling stalemate did not come from a brilliant tactical maneuver by the Senate's general, but from a mundane criminal conspiracy within the dictator's own ranks. Among Caesar's most trusted auxiliary forces were 2 Gallic cavalry commanders, Rucellus and Agis. These men were veterans of the Gallic Wars, heavily rewarded by the supreme commander for their past bravery. However, the severe logistical pressure and the isolation of the Dyrrhachium trenches bred a toxic greed. The 2 commanders began systematically embezzling the wages of their own troops, submitting false muster rolls to the quartermasters, and pocketing the silver meant for the starving cavalrymen. When the Gallic troopers discovered the theft, they bypassed their immediate superiors and brought the grievance directly to Caesar. Facing a complex political environment, Caesar chose a pragmatic approach. Unwilling to publicly humiliate key officers while his army was under siege, he reprimanded them privately, demanding they repay the stolen funds. But in the rigid, honor-bound hierarchy of a Roman military camp, the loss of prestige was absolute, and the threat of eventual execution loomed heavily over them. Driven by fear rather than any ideological loyalty to the Republic, Rucellus and Agis made a cold, calculated decision. Gathering their illicit wealth, the heavy clinking of stolen coins masked by the coastal winds, they mounted their horses under the cover of night and slipped across the treacherous expanse of no man's land to surrender to Pompey's frontline sentries. In ancient warfare, a massive static defense is only as impenetrable as the secrecy of its architecture. When the defectors were brought before Pompey, they handed the Senate's general an asset far more valuable than a cavalry squadron: the complete operational blueprint of Caesar's 5-mile circumvallation network. Rucellus and Agis detailed the exact rotation schedules of the Roman cohorts, the varying depths of the trenches, and the distances between the wooden redoubts. Most importantly, they exposed a fatal engineering flaw that Pompey's forward scouts could never have seen from their restricted vantage points behind the barricades. The defectors pointed to the southernmost extremity of the siege line, where Caesar's earthworks sloped down to meet the edge of the Adriatic Sea. In this specific sector, the fortifications were dangerously incomplete. Caesar's engineers had constructed the main outward-facing wall and a secondary inward-facing wall to protect against a sudden breakout, but they had not yet finished the crucial transverse rampart. This connecting lateral wall was essential to seal the corridor between the 2 main lines. Without it, the cohorts guarding the southern beach were entirely exposed to an attack from the sea. Any enemy force that managed to land on the shoreline could simply walk between the unfinished walls and strike the Roman defenders directly in the flank and rear. For Pompey, this precise intelligence was the key to unlocking the entire campaign. He knew his elite cavalry was slowly perishing from disease and lack of fresh water within the cramped inner perimeter, making an immediate breakout an absolute necessity. Rather than throwing his infantry into a grinding frontal assault against the elevated Roman redoubts, he could now bypass the heavy fortifications entirely. Armed with the blueprint of Caesar's vulnerability, Pompey mobilized his fleet in the dead of night, preparing a coordinated strike that the supreme commander would not see coming until it was too late. Pompey executed his plan with uncharacteristic speed and absolute precision. Instead of a desperate, disorganized breakout, the Senate's general orchestrated a highly complex, multi-pronged amphibious assault. Under the cover of total darkness, he loaded a massive strike force of light infantry, slingers, and archers onto his transport ships and smaller coastal vessels. Simultaneously, he ordered 60 cohorts of heavy legionaries, roughly 30,000 men, to silently march southward from his main camp. The coordination was flawless. The maritime fleet moved parallel to the marching columns, navigating the coastal waters without alerting Caesar's exhausted sentries. Pompey was effectively weaponizing his absolute control of the Adriatic Sea, using the water as an unobstructed flanking corridor to bypass the miles of trenches and timber walls his enemy had spent months constructing. As the first pale light of dawn crept over the Adriatic horizon, the amphibious strike force reached the extreme southern tip of the siege lines. This critical anchor point was held by cohorts of Caesar's veteran 9th Legion, operating under the command of the quaestor Marcellinus. These infantrymen were physically exhausted, suffering from severe malnutrition after weeks of subsisting on root bread, and stretched dangerously thin across the expanding fortifications. They were entirely unaware that the intelligence protecting their flank had been compromised by their own allied cavalry. Pompey's transport vessels quietly beached themselves directly on the shoreline, specifically targeting the exact coordinates where the transverse rampart remained unbuilt. The sea, which Caesar had confidently assumed would act as an impenetrable natural barrier, had just delivered a massive enemy force directly into his rear echelons. The assault commenced with a sudden, devastating barrage of arrows and sling stones, raining down out of the early morning mist. The projectiles struck the unshielded backs of Caesar's infantry as the amphibious troops poured unhindered through the unfinished gap in the fortifications. Almost simultaneously, Pompey's 60 cohorts of heavy legionaries struck the front of the Roman redoubts. The men of the 9th Legion were instantly caught in a lethal geometric trap. They were fighting heavily armed, well-fed infantry pushing uphill from the front, while a relentless shower of missiles tore into their rear ranks from the beachhead. The sheer volume of incoming fire pinned the defenders in place, rendering their large scuda shields useless against an attack converging from opposite directions. Roman tactical doctrine relied entirely on heavy infantry facing a singular direction and holding a rigid, overlapping shield wall, but the crossfire shattered this cohesion. The intelligence provided by the defectors proved catastrophically accurate. Because the transverse wall was missing, there was no physical barrier to halt the flanking light troops, who utilized their mobility to systematically target Caesar's centurions and standard-bearers. As the unit officers fell, the command structure of the defending cohorts began to dissolve. Outnumbered, bleeding out in a dual-front engagement, and lacking orders, the veterans of the 9th Legion were forced to abandon their fortified redoubts. They broke formation and retreated northward along the trench line, desperately attempting to distance themselves from the shoreline and re-establish a defensive front. However, the retreat quickly devolved into localized chaos as the narrow trenches funneled the fleeing men into a disorganized mass. Pompey pressed his advantage with methodical, ruthless efficiency. His advancing legionaries overran the southern forts, systematically tearing down the wooden palisades and filling the defensive ditches with earth and fascines to rapidly widen the breach for their pursuing cavalry. The entire southern anchor of Caesar's 15-mile circumvallation line had ceased to exist in a matter of hours. The senatorial forces were now inside the blockade, pouring into the space between the walls and rolling up Caesar's exposed flank. Pompey had achieved a complete tactical breakthrough, converting a static, attritional siege into a highly mobile, open-field offensive that perfectly leveraged his overwhelming numerical superiority. Recognizing the sudden collapse of the southern sector, Mark Antony, who commanded the nearest reserve forces, immediately ordered a countermarch to plug the hemorrhaging gap. He pushed his cohorts forward into the breach to stabilize the line, fighting desperately to buy precious time for the supreme commander to arrive with the main army. As the southern defense collapsed, Mark Antony rushed reinforcements to plug the gap, but the terrain and the panic were about to trigger a chain reaction that even Caesar could not control. The arrival of Mark Antony's reserves momentarily slowed the senatorial advance, but it was the arrival of the dictator himself that escalated the localized breach into a full-scale catastrophe. Caesar reached the southern sector, commanding 33 cohorts, roughly 15,000 heavy infantrymen, intent on immediately reclaiming the lost ground. He observed that Pompey had begun constructing a new fortified camp near the beachhead, utilizing an old, abandoned earthwork from earlier in the siege. Rather than stabilizing his defense and carefully assessing the compromised terrain, Caesar opted for aggressive, immediate retaliation. He divided his 33 cohorts into 2 wings, ordering a direct assault on the half-finished senatorial camp. It was a command decision rooted in his usual reliance on shock and speed, but it completely ignored the lethal geometry of the ground he was stepping into. The battlefield was not an open plain, but a claustrophobic maze of trenches, ditches, and high ramparts constructed and abandoned during previous phases of the siege. A long, disjointed wall extended from the old camp down toward a nearby river, bisecting the approach route. As Caesar's left wing successfully breached the outer rampart of Pompey's new camp and engaged in close quarters combat, his right wing collided with this old, overgrown wall. Disoriented by the terrain and unable to see the main engagement through the dense earthworks, the cohorts of the right wing marched parallel to the barrier, frantically searching for a gate. This geographical friction physically severed Caesar's army in half, isolating the right wing and permanently stripping away their mutual support. Pompey immediately identified the structural fracture in the Roman advance. He did not commit more infantry to the meat grinder. Instead, he unleashed his absolute tactical advantage. The Senate's general deployed a massive reserve of cavalry, supported by fresh cohorts of light infantry, directing them straight at Caesar's wandering right wing. As the senatorial horsemen crested the ridgeline, the isolated legionaries suddenly found themselves trapped in a narrow corridor between the old trench line and an incoming cavalry charge. The psychological shock was instantaneous. Men who had conquered Gaul and survived months of starvation suddenly realized they were cut off, outflanked, and devoid of a clear retreat route. Veteran discipline, the bedrock of Caesar's military machine, evaporated in a matter of seconds. The right wing broke formation entirely and initiated a frantic, disorganized flight back toward their own lines. However, escaping required navigating the exact same narrow trench gates and steep earthworks they had just crossed. As thousands of heavily armored men funneled into these tight choke points, the retreat transformed into a fatal bottleneck. The sheer kinetic pressure of terrified soldiers pressing against one another created a suffocating crush within the deep ditches. The air filled with the sharp, metallic grinding of iron armor buckling as men were pinned against the earthen walls by the weight of their own comrades. In this confined slaughterhouse, More of Caesar's veterans were trampled to death beneath hobnailed boots than were killed by senatorial swords. The panic was highly contagious. Seeing the right wing shatter and the cavalry sweeping inward, the left wing, currently fighting inside Pompey's camp, realized their flank was completely exposed and immediately joined the rout. The entire counterattack disintegrated. The command structure vanished entirely as centurions and tribunes were swept away in the tide of fleeing infantry. Caesar himself rode directly into the chaos, physically attempting to halt the mass disintegration. He rode up to a fleeing standard-bearer, grabbed the man by the shoulders, and demanded he turn the eagle back to face the enemy. In a stark display of the total collapse of authority, the terrified soldier did not just ignore the supreme commander. He raised his weapon to strike Caesar before tearing himself away and leaving the standard behind in the dirt. Caesar was powerless. His legendary charisma could not countermand the primal instinct of mass panic. The tactical breakdown was absolute, resulting in nearly 1,000 dead legionaries and the loss of 32 sacred standards in a single morning. Caesar watched his invincible army dissolve into a terrified mob, completely exposed on the open ground. The war, his career, and his life were now entirely at the mercy of his greatest rival. Pompey the Great stood at the precipice of absolute, war-ending victory. His forces had successfully rolled up the southern siege lines, secured the captured earthworks, and taken 32 of Caesar's legionary standards, a staggering humiliation for a previously undefeated army. In the blood-soaked mud of the trenches lay roughly 1,000 of Caesar's veterans, the vast majority crushed or suffocated in the sheer panic of their own rout, rather than killed by senatorial swords. The surviving Caesarian cohorts were scattered, disorganized, and fleeing in blind terror across the open terrain toward their primary encampment. In this fleeting, decisive window, Pompey possessed the numerical superiority, the momentum, and the fresh, heavy cavalry required to ride down the remnants of his rival's forces and conclude the civil war before the sun reached its zenith. All that was required was the order for a general pursuit. Yet the fatal command never came. Pompey was a profoundly methodical, traditionally minded commander who had built his illustrious, decades-long career on logistical supremacy and carefully calculated risks, not reckless battlefield gambles. Staring out over the claustrophobic maze of Caesar's abandoned ditches, palisades, and half-built redoubts, the Senate's general saw a landscape perfectly designed for a counter-ambush. To Pompey, a general who had conquered the East through patient, grinding operations, pushing his men blindly into unmapped enemy fortifications, violated every rule of Roman warfare. He fundamentally suspected that the sudden catastrophic collapse of his rival's veteran infantry was simply too total to be genuine. Fearing that Caesar was executing a highly disciplined feigned retreat to draw the senatorial cavalry into a deadly bottleneck within the trench network, Pompey commanded his hornblowers to sound the recall. He ordered his advancing legions to halt their pursuit, prioritizing the consolidation of the ground he had just won over the potential annihilation of a desperate enemy. This single command decision exposed the fundamental difference in military philosophy between the two greatest generals of the Republic. Where Caesar routinely risked his own complete ruin for the fleeting chance of total victory, Pompey refused to jeopardize a mathematically secured tactical win for an unpredictable pursuit. The thick coastal dust slowly settled as the senatorial heavy infantry stopped their advance, grounding their shields to fortify their newly captured positions. The senatorial forces held the high ground and the momentum, but their commander's psychological rigidity tethered them in place. This abrupt halt allowed Caesar's shattered formations the precious time they needed to slip away and breathe. By adhering strictly to conservative military doctrine in a moment that demanded ruthless aggression, Pompey unknowingly squandered the one singular opportunity where his enemy was completely defenseless and stripped of unit cohesion. As the fleeing soldiers finally reached the relative safety of their main camp and began to reform their broken lines, the stark reality of the morning's events settled over the exhausted Roman commanders. Caesar, standing among his demoralized survivors, understood exactly how close he had just come to historical erasure. He recognized that his salvation was not the result of Roman discipline or his own tactical genius, but purely the byproduct of his opponent's hesitation. Caesar was allowed to pull his bleeding army back from the brink of annihilation, leading him to utter a single sentence that would define the rest of the war. Today, the victory had been the enemy's. Julius Caesar bluntly admitted to his exhausted officers in the aftermath of the rout, had there been anyone among them to gain it. This chilling, pragmatic assessment marked the immediate conclusion of the Dyrrhachium campaign. Recognizing that his logistical framework had violently collapsed and that his sprawling siege lines were now a fractured death trap, Caesar ordered a rapid, highly disciplined withdrawal. Under the cover of night, the battered and starving legions quietly abandoned their trench networks. Leaving their campfires burning brightly to deceive the senatorial watchtowers and mask the heavy sound of their departure, Caesar systematically broke contact. He force-marched his army eastward, turning his back on the Adriatic coast to drive his men into the rugged, mountainous interior of the Balkans. The retreat toward the fertile plains of Thessaly fundamentally altered the strategic theater of the great Roman Civil War. The bloody catastrophe at Dyrrhachium forcefully cured Caesar of his tactical hubris regarding static siege warfare. He had attempted an impossible geographic paradox, caging a numerically superior, fully supplied enemy of 50,000 men with an overextended, starving force, relying purely on the sheer physical endurance of his infantry to defy the laws of logistics. It was an engineering marvel that predictably unraveled into near annihilation. By abandoning the coastline, Caesar immediately neutralized Pompey's absolute naval supremacy. The Senate's general could no longer rely on his secure maritime tether to finish the war. Pompey was forced to leave his impenetrable supply hub and pursue the Caesarian legions deep into the unforgiving continental interior. The conflict would no longer be decided by shovels, wooden redoubts, and coastal blockades, but by a high-stakes, mobile campaign of maneuver. The legacy of the Dyrrhachium blockade stands as a grim testament to the brutal, unyielding realities of ancient military supply lines, highlighting the razor-thin margin between absolute ruin and historical immortality. Caesar had orchestrated a massive operational blunder, pushing his 35,000 veterans beyond the absolute limits of human endurance, only to have his entire strategy dismantled by a localized intelligence breach and a catastrophic chain reaction of command panic. Yet, the deep structural resilience of the Roman heavy infantry, combined with Pompey's fatal, conservative caution, allowed the supreme commander to survive a defeat that should have ended his life. The 1.5-mile coastal cage ultimately served merely as a grueling, attritional prelude. The final, definitive reckoning between the two greatest commanders of the Roman Republic would not be fought in the muddy, blood-stained trenches of the Adriatic, but weeks later, on the sun-baked, open fields of Pharsalus. Subscribe to our channel to relive the great chapters of history together, and join us for the next episode of World Chronicles.